So they were making a statement of, we are here and we hope to stay here, but they saw the immigration trends being as they were. So in the late 1880s already, lots of Eastern Europeans, the Irish were coming in. God help us, the Irish. We don't want the Irish, as the joke goes from Blazing Saddles. I can say that because I'm Irish. They built this beautiful place, and all the buildings were built about the same time, so you can see a real harmony in the architecture. But one of the problems was, how long would it last? So already, the initial windows were the lower windows. You can see all the famous names of the early families of Detroit. So Beaubien, Campeau, Hamelin, all right, all these famous names of the early families. Those were all done in French. The upper row of windows were windows transported from the old 1818 church. So those windows, the oldest stained glass windows in the city of Detroit, are the upper level windows in this church, and they're beautiful. And they were installed in the 1818 church in the 1820s sometime. So when they were demolishing the church, they made real careful to pull out the windows, the altar, the communion rail, and all of those elements were integrated into this church. And also they brought and they interred the Father Gabriel Richard under the main altar at the time. Later that was moved and he's back in the chapel now where you can go visit that. So I think one interesting turning point, the big windows of the transept that go across, the big ones, those are a different style than the rest of them. Those are replacements. The originals were blown out in the big storm in 1914. So give it a few years, they must have replaced them, 1920-ish, let's say. Those windows were in English. So the original windows were French, the replacement windows were English. Gives you an idea. And I would love to do some research after I retire into, if I can find old archives from the time. Hello. And to do this, understand what was happening. I would love to see a collection of parish bulletins from the time when these things were going on, just to see what was going through people's heads. So we have an absolute treasure here, and the objective of this event is not just to celebrate the history of the native peoples and the French, but our benefits go to the 501c3, which is separate from normal parish functions. It's just for the buildings. It's for the buildings. As you probably realize, the church is on the National Register of Historic Landmarks, and we need to be able to protect and preserve our history here. So there's been wonderful things happening, and we're happy to be here. We have our Canadian friends. Any Canadians out there? We got any Canadians? So there's some here. I told them they could get in at par. They like to get in with their Canadian dollar. Also, remember, we've got the basket raffle in back, and we have our reenactors here along the side, along with our food. The Spirits Rising will be here in a few minutes, and we are available. If you have any questions, anybody wants to, I know a lot of times people stop me afterwards and they say, why didn't you say this, or what about this? Raise your hand, you can ask me. I'm always interested to talk about Detroit history. I'm far from an expert, but we at the Alliance Française, we organize a Detroit French history cruise on the river. I think some of you have been on that. We do it every year, once a year in the summer. The benefits from that go for a free cruise for high school kids who are studying French. Their teachers love this because the kids realize, hey, you don't have to go to Montreal, you don't have to go to Paris French is here in our history, and it's also just across the river. Most people don't know that although the French speakers were assimilated on this side of the river, because the French school stopped, and St. Anne was the last one to stop about 1920, I believe. On the other side of the river, during the First World War, the Ontario government tried to stop all French schools, and they were doing it because they said, the empire is at war, we all need to be good patriots, and all schools need to be in English. And they passed this law in 1917, and it's called Bill 17 as a result. And it was basically a way to use the First World War as an excuse to stop French language education. There is a great story, which is another chapter, I won't bore you with all of that took place on the other side of the river. The three major points along the river, St. Anne's, Assumption across the river, and then later there was a church built around 1900, and it was called Notre Dame du Lac, Our Lady of the Lake. And it's right across from the tip of Belle Isle near the distillery, all right? In 1917, the Bishop of Southwestern Ontario, the Diocese of London, told the pastor there, change your school from French to English. The pastor was not happy. He was a Francophone. He went to London to see the bishop personally, asked to say, please, please let us keep our French school. The bishop refused. The pastor came back home. By chance, or whatever, he died in his sleep that night. The parishioners took this as a word to say, we need to keep this battle going. And when the replacement pastor was sent the following week, the parishioners made a cordon around the school. Great. Made a cordon around the school and the church, refusing to let the new pastor in. And it was called, there was riots. It was called the riots of Ford City. That's what that part of Windsor was known around the Ford plant. And because of that major resistance all across Ontario, but here in Windsor, across the river from Detroit, the sensitivity of Ontario and all across Canada to French education became such that the bill was overturned later and French schooling remained. That was 100 years ago, and there still are today a minority, about 2-3% of the population, native French speakers at home. They have two different school boards, a Catholic and non-Catholic school board, all kinds of organizations. I'm part of a few of them, and I'm happy to take anybody over there. Anybody wants to do this, so I will now shut up now that the band's ready to go. All right, so let us take us again to Spirits Rising. Guys, girls, take it over.